What would you do if a simple act of kindness plunged you into a dangerous game of cat and mouse with powerful enemies? For Ethan Carter, an unassuming mechanic from a quiet town, life was all about fixing cars and making ends meet until one rainy night changed everything. When Ethan stopped to help a stranded woman on the side of the road, he had no idea she was running from a dangerous secret. What began as a good deed soon spiraled into a high-stakes journey involving corrupt corporations, relentless mercenaries, and a piece of evidence so explosive it could bring entire empires to their knees. Ethan's bravery is tested at every turn as he races to protect the truth, forge unlikely alliances, and stay one step ahead of enemies who will stop at nothing to silence him. But can an ordinary man rise to meet extraordinary challenges, and at what cost? The rain poured relentlessly as Ethan Carter drove his old, sputtering truck home from another grueling shift at the auto repair shop. His thoughts drifted between the rising bills and his aging truck's growing list of issues. But just as he rounded a bend on the winding country road, his headlights illuminated a sight that made him slow down a car stranded on the shoulder. Hazard lights blinking, a woman stood outside the vehicle, her coat pulled tight around her against the storm's chill. She waved hesitantly as Ethan pulled over. "Need some help?" Ethan called out, stepping into the rain. The woman nodded, her expression equal parts relief and exhaustion. "The car just died. I don't know what's wrong." Ethan crouched to check the engine, quickly diagnosing the problem as a dead battery. "I can jump-start it," he said, fetching cables from his truck. As he worked, the woman introduced herself as Catherine Lane. She seemed nervous, constantly glancing down the road, though Ethan chalked it up to the miserable weather. When her car roared to life, she smiled for the first time. "Thank you so much," Catherine said. She reached into her bag. "Let me pay you for this." Ethan waved her off. "No need. Just pay it forward someday." Catherine paused, her expression softening. Not many people would stop these days. "You've got a kind heart, Mr. Carter," he replied, shaking water from his jacket. Catherine hesitated for a moment, her gaze lingering on him. "You have no idea how much this means to me." She gave him a grateful smile before driving off into the storm. Ethan thought little of the encounter afterward, returning to his modest home and collapsing into bed. 2 days later, a deep, rhythmic thrum pulled Ethan from his thoughts as he stood in the garage, replacing a tire. The sound grew louder until a sleek helicopter descended just beyond the shop's parking lot. "What in the world?" Ethan muttered, wiping his hands on a rag. Several people in dark suits exited the aircraft, their movements brisk and purposeful. One of them, a tall man with a sharp demeanor, approached Ethan. "Mr. Carter?" the man asked. Yeah, that's me," Ethan replied, suspicion creeping into his voice. The man handed Ethan an envelope sealed with an unfamiliar emblem. "We're here on behalf of someone you helped recently, Catherine Lane." Ethan's heart skipped. "Catherine? What's going on?" "You'll find answers inside," the man said, stepping back toward the helicopter. Ethan opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a note written in elegant script. "Ethan, your kindness saved me in ways you don't understand. Come with us. You won't regret it." He stared at the words, his mind spinning. The memory of Catherine's gratitude now seemed layered with something he couldn't quite place. Who was she? And why had his simple act of kindness triggered something so extraordinary? Ethan looked up at the waiting helicopter. He knew this was more than he bargained for, but his curiosity overrode his hesitation. "All right," he said, climbing aboard, unaware that this decision would change his life forever. Ethan peered out of the helicopter window as the familiar countryside gave way to rolling hills and dense woods. Soon, the trees parted to reveal an expansive estate that looked plucked from the pages of a fairy tale. A sprawling mansion stood at the center, surrounded by manicured gardens, fountains, and a long driveway lined with lanterns glowing softly in the fading daylight. He couldn't shake the surreal feeling. Just days ago, he was patching up broken engines and worrying about overdue bills. Now, he was descending into a world that felt worlds apart from his own. When the helicopter landed, the man who had handed him the letter gestured for Ethan to follow. Inside, the mansion was even more impressive: polished marble floors, soaring ceilings, and artwork that seemed too valuable to exist in one place. "Is Catherine here?" Ethan asked, his voice echoing slightly in the grand foyer. "She is," the man replied curtly, leading him down a long corridor. They stopped at a set of large double doors, and with a nod, the man opened them. Catherine stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, her silhouette framed against the golden light of the setting sun. She was dressed elegantly, her confidence and composure a stark contrast to the drenched, anxious woman Ethan had met on the roadside. "Ethan," she said warmly, turning to greet him, "I'm so glad you came." Ethan hesitated. "This is a lot. I don't know what I'm doing here." Catherine smiled and motioned for him to sit on one of the plush armchairs by the window. "You're here because you stopped to help a stranger, something most people wouldn't have done." Ethan sat, but his unease lingered. "I just jump-started a car. I don't understand why it's turned into all this." Catherine's expression softened, but her eyes carried a weight that made Ethan shift in his seat. "I didn't tell you the full truth that night," she admitted. "I wasn't just stranded, I was running." "Running?" Ethan repeated, frowning. Catherine nodded. "There are people out there who want to hurt me. People who would have found me if you hadn't stopped when you did. That moment gave me enough time to disappear, just long enough to be safe." Ethan leaned back, processing her words. "Why would anyone want to hurt you?" Catherine hesitated, then gestured toward a side table. On it was a folder with a sleek, embossed emblem, one Ethan vaguely recognized as belonging to a high-profile philanthropic organization. "I'm part of something much larger than myself," Catherine explained. "An organization that works to expose corruption and bring justice to those who abuse power. But doing the right thing often comes with risks. Recently, we uncovered information about some dangerous people. They found out we were behind it, and I became a target." Ethan blinked. "So that night you were escaping," Catherine finished. "And your kindness, your willingness to stop, without knowing who I was or what was at stake, saved me." Ethan felt a mix of disbelief and unease. "Why bring me here then? I'm just a mechanic. I don't belong in whatever this is." Catherine's smile returned, though it carried a hint of mystery. "That's exactly why you belong. You're honest, hard-working, and you don't expect anything in return for helping others. That makes you rare." She leaned forward, her gaze steady. "Ethan, I brought you here because I need your help. Not just to repay a debt, but because I believe you're the kind of person who can make a difference. But before you decide, there's something you need to see." She stood and walked toward the doors, gesturing for him to follow. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then rose, his curiosity outweighing his unease. As they left the room and moved deeper into the mansion, Ethan couldn't help but wonder, what exactly had he gotten himself into? Ethan followed Catherine through the dimly lit halls of the mansion, his boots clicking against the polished marble floor. The air grew heavier as they descended a spiral staircase that seemed to burrow into the earth itself. The opulence of the upper floors faded, replaced by cold stone walls and narrow passages. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, his voice bouncing off the walls. "To the vault," Catherine replied over her shoulder. "It's where we keep the most sensitive information about our work." Ethan's unease deepened. "Why do you need me to see this?" Catherine stopped at a heavy metal door embedded into the wall. She placed her hand on a biometric scanner, and with a soft beep, the door unlocked. "Because once you know what's in here, you'll understand why I need someone I can trust." The door creaked open, revealing a stark, sterile room lined with monitors, filing cabinets, and secure safes. At the center stood a large table covered in documents, maps, and photographs. Catherine gestured for Ethan to step inside. "What is all this?" he asked, scanning the room. "This is everything we've gathered on the people we're working against," Catherine explained, walking to the table and picking up a photograph. She handed it to Ethan. The image showed a man in an expensive suit shaking hands with a government official. At first glance it seemed mundane, but the caption below read, "James Dwyer, CEO of Dynatech Industries, linked to illegal arms deals and human trafficking." Ethan frowned. "You're saying this guy is involved in all of that?" Catherine nodded. "And he's just one of many. These people operate in the shadows, manipulating economies, governments, and lives for their gain. They use wealth and power to silence anyone who opposes them." Ethan set the photo down, his hands trembling slightly. "What does this have to do with me?" Catherine picked up a thick folder and opened it, revealing more photos, bank statements, and handwritten notes. "The night you helped me, I was on my way to deliver this to someone who could expose them, but they found out, and I had to run. These documents contain proof of their crimes, and I couldn't risk them falling into the wrong hands." Ethan's stomach churned as he flipped through the pages. Each detail painted a darker picture of the people Catherine described. "So what now? You're safe, right? Why not just hand this over to the authorities?" Catherine sighed. "The authorities are compromised. Dynatech has people on the inside, lawyers, politicians, even law enforcement. If we hand this over, it'll disappear, and we'll all be targets again." She leaned against the table, her expression grave. "That's why I need someone like you. Someone outside this world, someone they'd never suspect. I want you to help us finish what I started." Ethan stared at her, incredulous. "You think I can take on people like this? I'm just a mechanic. I fix trucks, not global conspiracies." Catherine smiled faintly. "That's exactly why you're perfect. You're not part of their world, and that makes you unpredictable. Besides, I've seen what you can do. You've got the skill, the heart, and the determination." Ethan took a step back, shaking his head. "This is insane. I can't—" Before he could finish, an alarm blared, the shrill sound echoing through the room. Catherine's expression hardened as she rushed to one of the monitors. "They found us," she said, her voice tight with urgency. Ethan froze. "Who? Dynatech?" Catherine nodded, grabbing a sleek metal case from under the table and shoving the documents inside. "We don't have time to explain. We need to move." Ethan's heart pounded as Catherine handed him the case. "Take this," she said. "It's the only copy of the evidence. If they get it, everything we've worked for is gone." Ethan hesitated, staring at the case in his hands. "Catherine, Trust me," she interrupted, gripping his shoulder. "You're stronger than you think. Now go." The urgency in her voice propelled Ethan forward. With the case in hand, he followed Catherine back up the stairs, the sound of distant footsteps and muffled voices growing louder. As they reached the mansion's upper levels, Ethan realized the gravity of his situation. He wasn't just a mechanic anymore. He was now holding the key to a truth that powerful people would kill to bury. Ethan barely had time to process Catherine's words as they burst into the grand hall of the mansion. The sound of the alarm was deafening, and the rhythmic pounding of footsteps from the lower levels signaled that Dynatech's operatives were closing in. "Catherine, how do we get out of here?" Ethan shouted over the chaos. She grabbed his arm and led him toward a side corridor. "There's an escape route through the gardens. Stay close and don't stop running." They sprinted through the labyrinthine halls, the mansion's grandeur now a blur. As they turned a corner, Ethan caught sight of men in tactical gear entering the building through the main doors. They carried weapons, their movements coordinated and precise. "They're serious about this," Ethan muttered, gripping the metal case tighter. "They've been after this evidence for months," Catherine replied, her voice laced with urgency. "If they get it, it's over." They reached a side door that opened into the gardens. Rain pelted down, soaking them instantly as they dashed through the manicured hedges. Ethan's boots slipped on the wet stone paths, but he kept moving, Catherine's figure just ahead of him. The sound of shouting and heavy boots echoed behind them, growing closer with every second. "They're gaining on us!" Ethan called out. Catherine turned sharply toward a narrow pathway obscured by dense foliage. "This way! It'll take us to the helipad." Ethan followed, his heart pounding. The path was slippery and uneven, and the rain blurred his vision, but he pressed on. They emerged into a clearing where the helicopter was waiting, its rotors already spinning. "Go! Get to the helicopter!" Catherine shouted, waving him forward. Ethan hesitated, looking back toward the mansion. Figures in black tactical gear were emerging from the gardens, their weapons raised. "What about you?" "I'll hold them off," she said, pulling a small pistol from her jacket. Ethan's stomach dropped. "Are you crazy? You'll never make it." Catherine shook her head, her expression firm. "This evidence is more important than either of us. Get it to safety. That's how you can help." Before Ethan could argue, Catherine turned and fired a warning shot into the air. The operatives hesitated for a moment, giving Ethan the time. He needed to sprint toward the helicopter. He reached the aircraft just as one of the pilots reached out to pull him aboard. "Let's go!" the pilot shouted. Ethan clambered into the cabin, the case still clutched in his hands. He turned to see Catherine still in the clearing, firing another shot before disappearing into the foliage. The operatives swarmed the area, their shouts drowned out by the roar of the helicopter as it lifted off. "Is she going to be okay?" Ethan asked, his voice barely audible over the noise. The pilot glanced at him grimly. "She knew the risks. Our job is to get you and that case out of here." Ethan sank into his seat, his hands trembling as he looked down at the metal case. He couldn't shake the image of Catherine standing alone in the rain, facing overwhelming odds. The helicopter ascended into the stormy sky, leaving the estate and the chaos behind. Ethan stared out the window, his mind racing. He had no idea where they were headed or what would come next, but one thing was clear. He was now part of something far bigger than himself. As the lights of the mansion faded into the distance, Ethan tightened his grip on the case. Whatever secrets it held, he was determined to see this through. But as he sat in the dim cabin, questions gnawed at him. Why had Catherine chosen him? And could he live up to the trust she had placed in him? The helicopter shuddered slightly as it flew deeper into the storm. Ethan took a deep breath, steeling himself for the unknown. Whatever lay ahead, he knew there was no turning back now. The storm raged as the helicopter flew over the dark countryside, its rhythmic shudder matching Ethan's pounding heart. He stared at the case in his lap, the weight of its contents pressing down on him. He still couldn't believe how drastically his life had changed in just a matter of days. The pilot's voice crackled through his headset. "We'll be landing soon. There's a safe house up ahead where you'll meet someone who can help." "Help with what?" Ethan asked, his voice tight. "I don't even know what I'm supposed to do next." "Keep that case safe," the pilot replied simply. Ethan sighed and looked out the window as the helicopter began its descent. Below, a small farmhouse surrounded by dense woods came into view. The building was unassuming, with a single porch light glowing dimly in the rain. The helicopter touched down in a clearing nearby, and Ethan jumped out, shielding the case from the rain with his jacket. A figure emerged from the farmhouse, a flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Ethan Carter?" the man called out, his voice steady but cautious. "Yeah, that's me," Ethan replied, clutching the case tightly. The man approached, his features becoming clearer under the flashlight's beam. He was tall with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "I'm Robert Hayes," he said, extending a hand. "Catherine sent word that you were coming." Ethan shook his hand, his grip firm despite his nerves. "Did she make it out?" Robert hesitated, his expression unreadable. We'll discuss that inside. Come on, it's not safe out here. Ethan followed Robert into the farmhouse. The interior was sparse but functional, with maps and surveillance equipment spread across a large table in the center of the room. A faint hum of static came from a radio in the corner. "Take a seat," Robert said, motioning to a chair. "You've had quite the night." Ethan sat down, placing the case on the table. "Catherine said this was important," he began. "She said it's the only copy of the evidence." Robert nodded, his expression grave. "She's right. What's in that case could expose one of the largest corruption networks in the world. Dynatech and their allies will do anything to get it back." Ethan leaned back, his exhaustion catching up with him. "I'm a mechanic, not some secret agent. I don't know how I ended up in the middle of this." Robert smiled faintly. "Sometimes it's the ordinary people who make the biggest difference. Catherine saw something in you: integrity, courage. You proved that the night you stopped to help her." Ethan shook his head. "I didn't sign up for this. I just wanted to do the right thing." "And you did," Robert said. "But now you're in a position to do even more." Robert opened the case, carefully sorting through the documents inside. Ethan watched as he worked, his movements methodical and precise. "This evidence is solid," Robert said after a moment. "Financial records, contracts, emails. It's enough to take down Dynatech and everyone involved." "Then why not hand it over to the authorities?" Ethan asked. "Because the system is compromised," Robert replied. "Dynatech has people in every corner: law enforcement, government, even the media. If we go through the usual channels, this will disappear." Ethan felt the weight of the situation settling over him like a heavy blanket. "So, what's the plan?" Robert looked up, his eyes serious. "First, we secure the evidence. Then we take it to someone who can expose it to the public without interference. It won't be easy, but it's the only way." Before Ethan could respond, the radio crackled to life, a distorted voice coming through. "Movement detected on the perimeter. Multiple heat signatures." Robert's expression hardened. He grabbed a rifle from the wall and handed Ethan a small, unassuming handgun. "Looks like Dynatech isn't wasting any time." Ethan stared at the weapon in his hand, his pulse quickening. He'd never held a gun before, much less used one. "I'm not sure I can do this," he admitted. Robert placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You've come this far, Ethan. Trust yourself. We'll get through this." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed outside, and Ethan knew there was no turning back. He tightened his grip on the gun, his heart pounding as the storm outside raged on. The first crack of gunfire shattered the tense silence, sending adrenaline coursing through Ethan's veins. He flinched instinctively, gripping the small handgun Robert had given him. "Stay low," Robert barked, crouching near a window as he peered into the rain-soaked night. "They're coming from the north and west, at least 6 of them." Ethan crouched behind the heavy wooden table in the center of the room. His mind raced, the cold metal of the gun unfamiliar in his hands. 6? What are we supposed to do against that? Robert turned, his expression calm but focused. "We hold them off long enough to get out of here. This isn't about winning a fight. It's about surviving." Ethan nodded, his throat dry. The farmhouse, while sturdy, offered limited protection. Through the window he could see shadows moving between the trees, growing closer with each passing second. "Take this," Robert said, tossing a small earpiece to Ethan. "We need to stay in communication." Ethan fumbled to place it in his ear, his hands trembling. Before he could ask what the plan was, Robert stood and fired 2 precise shots through the open window. A shout of pain from outside confirmed a hit. "They're testing us," Robert muttered, ducking back, "trying to see how prepared we are." Ethan's breath came in shallow bursts as the attackers returned fire. Bullets slammed into the walls, sending splinters flying. "They seem pretty prepared themselves," he said, his voice shaking. Robert gave him a grim smile. "They think they're up against amateurs. Let's show them they're wrong." A sharp thud against the front door made Ethan whirl around. The door shuddered again, as if someone was trying to break it down. "They're coming in!" he shouted. Robert moved quickly, grabbing a metal bar and sliding it across the door to reinforce it. "Not yet, they're not." But even as Robert spoke, the attackers outside began using heavier force. Explosions of wood and glass filled the air as they targeted windows and weaker points in the walls. "Ethan!" Robert shouted, tossing him a bag from the corner of the room. "Inside smoke grenades. Use them to cover our escape." Ethan unzipped the bag, his hands still unsteady. He pulled out a small canister and looked at Robert. "I've never used one of these before." "Pull the pin, toss it, and don't breathe the smoke," Robert said, firing another round into the darkness. Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He pulled the pin, feeling the metal pop free, and lobbed the grenade toward the shattered window. A hiss filled the air as thick white smoke billowed outward, obscuring their attackers' view. "Good! Now move!" Robert barked, grabbing the metal case from the table. They bolted toward the back of the house as the attackers struggled to navigate the smoke screen. Robert led the way to a trap door hidden beneath a worn rug. "This leads to a tunnel," he said, throwing it open. "It's old, but it'll get us out of here." Ethan hesitated for a moment, the sound of heavy footsteps echoing closer. He could hear the attackers shouting, their voices distorted by the smoke and rain. "Go!" Robert shouted, motioning toward the tunnel. Ethan scrambled down the ladder, the narrow space lit by a single dim bulb. The air was damp and smelled of earth, but it was better than being upstairs with bullets flying. Robert followed, closing the trap door behind them. They moved quickly through the tunnel, their footsteps splashing in shallow puddles. "Where does this lead?" Ethan asked, his voice hushed. "About half a mile into the woods," Robert replied. "There's a vehicle stashed there. If we can reach it, we'll have a shot at getting out of here." Ethan nodded, pushing himself to move faster despite the growing ache in his legs. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly, each twist and turn a reminder of how unprepared he was for this life. Finally, they emerged into the open air, the rain still falling in sheets. Robert pointed to a camouflage-covered jeep hidden beneath a cluster of trees. "There," he said. But as they approached, a new sound reached Ethan's ears, a low growl, accompanied by the crunch of boots on wet leaves. He froze, his heart sinking. "They're here," he whispered. Robert's jaw tightened. "Then we make our stand." Ethan gripped the gun in his hand, the cold metal a stark reminder of the stakes. He didn't know if he had what it took to survive this, but one thing was certain. He had to try. The growl of engines pierced through the rain as Ethan and Robert crouched behind the camouflaged jeep. Bright beams of headlights sliced through the dark forest, bouncing off the slick leaves and creating eerie shadows that danced across the trees. "They've got backup," Robert muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the storm. Ethan tightened his grip on the handgun, the weight of it still foreign in his trembling hands. "How are we supposed to get out of here?" Robert glanced toward the jeep, then back at Ethan. "We're not outrunning them on foot. Our best shot is to take the vehicle and break through their line." Ethan's stomach churned at the thought. "What if we don't make it?" Robert's expression was grim but resolute. "Then we make sure that case doesn't fall into their hands. Do you trust me?" Ethan hesitated for a heartbeat before nodding. "Let's do it." "Good." Robert slipped toward the jeep's driver's side door, moving with practiced precision. He signaled for Ethan to follow and climb into the passenger seat. Ethan scrambled inside, his wet clothes sticking to the leather seat. The engine roared to life, and before he could fully settle, Robert slammed on the gas, sending the jeep lurching forward. The headlights of their pursuers swiveled toward them as the jeep tore through the underbrush. Shouts erupted behind them, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. Bullets whizzed past, one shattering the side mirror. "Hold on!" Robert yelled as he veered sharply to avoid a fallen tree. The Jeep bounced violently over the uneven terrain, throwing Ethan against the door. "They're right behind us!" Ethan shouted, glancing at the side mirror or what was left of it. "Not for long," Robert replied, his focus razor-sharp. He navigated the winding forest paths with an almost uncanny familiarity, taking sharp turns and weaving through obstacles. The pursuers weren't giving up easily. A black SUV burst through the trees, its grille bearing down on them. Ethan's breath caught as the larger vehicle gained ground. "They're going to ram us!" he shouted. "Not if I ram them first," Robert said, his voice ice-cold. Before Ethan could protest, Robert jerked the wheel hard to the right, sending the Jeep skidding into the SUV's side. The impact jarred both vehicles, and the SUV swerved, smashing into a tree with a sickening crunch. "Still breathing?" Robert asked, glancing at Ethan. "Barely," Ethan replied, clutching the case protectively. "Good. Keep it that way." The temporary victory was short-lived. Another pair of headlights appeared ahead, blocking the path. Ethan's pulse quickened as the silhouette of armed figures emerged from the vehicle. "Robert, we're trapped!" "Not yet," Robert said, slamming the Jeep into reverse. The Jeep roared backward, dodging incoming gunfire, until Robert spun the wheel and executed a sharp turn, narrowly avoiding a ditch. He pushed the accelerator to the floor, the engine growling as the Jeep tore through the forest once more. "Where are we going?" Ethan asked, his voice cracking under the pressure. "There's an old bridge up ahead," Robert said. "If we can cross it, we'll lose them in the canyon." "And if we don't?" Robert didn't answer. The bridge came into view moments later, a narrow, rickety structure that looked barely stable enough to hold its own weight, let alone the speeding Jeep. Ethan's heart sank. "That's the plan?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "It's all we've got," Robert replied, flooring the gas. The Jeep barreled onto the bridge, the wooden planks creaking ominously under the strain. The canyon below was a yawning black void, the sound of rushing water echoing faintly in the distance. Behind them, the remaining SUVs skidded to a halt, their drivers hesitating at the sight of the fragile bridge. For a moment, it seemed they might have a chance. But then, one SUV roared forward, its driver willing to take the risk. "They're following us," Ethan shouted. "I see them," Robert growled. As the Jeep neared the other side, the bridge groaned under the combined weight of the vehicles. The sound of snapping wood filled the air, and Ethan's stomach lurched as the planks behind them began to give way. "Hold on!" Robert yelled, gunning the engine. With a final surge, the Jeep leapt off the collapsing bridge and onto solid ground. The SUV behind them wasn't so lucky. The structure crumbled beneath it, sending the vehicle plunging into the darkness below. Ethan gasped for air, his hands gripping the dashboard as the Jeep skidded to a halt. He looked back at the ruined bridge, the reality of their narrow escape sinking in. Robert turned to him, his expression grim but triumphant. "We're not out of this yet, but we just bought ourselves some time." Ethan nodded, his breath still coming in ragged gasps. "What now?" Robert glanced at the case in Ethan's lap. "Now we make sure their time runs out before ours does." The storm continued to rage as they drove deeper into the night, the shattered bridge behind them a symbol of how far they'd come, and the dangers that still lay ahead. The rain eased into a steady drizzle as Robert guided the Jeep onto an old service road, its muddy path winding deeper into the woods. The adrenaline from their harrowing escape still coursed through Ethan's veins, though the quiet around them offered a brief moment of solace. "Where are we heading now?" Ethan asked, gripping the metal case protectively. "There's a secondary safe house about 30 miles from here," Robert said, his eyes scanning the rearview mirror. "It's off the grid. We'll regroup and figure out our next steps." Ethan leaned back, his mind spinning. Why does this feel like it's never going to end? No matter where we go, they find us. Robert glanced at him. Because they have resources more than we do. But they also underestimate us. That's our edge. The road grew rougher, the Jeep's tires slipping slightly in the mud. Ethan clutched the dashboard as Robert navigated a sharp turn. Ahead, a dim light flickered through the trees. "That's it," Robert said, slowing the Jeep. The safe house was a small, dilapidated cabin, its wooden exterior weathered by years of neglect. A single bulb hung above the door, casting a weak glow onto the porch. "This doesn't scream safe to me," Ethan muttered as they parked. "That's the point," Robert replied, stepping out. "No one looks for secrets in plain sight." Ethan followed, the case still clutched tightly in his hands. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A single room with a table, a few chairs, and a cot pushed into the corner. A shortwave radio sat on the table, along with a map marked with various locations. Robert moved quickly, checking the windows and doors before setting his rifle down. "We'll stay here until morning. Then we move." Ethan placed the case on the table, the weight of it almost symbolic of the burden he carried. He sank into a chair, exhaustion settling over him like a heavy blanket. "What happens if this evidence actually makes it out?" he asked. "Do you really think it'll change anything?" Robert paused, his gaze steady. "It's not about what I think, it's about giving the truth a chance. Without it, people like Dynatech keep winning. With it, we at least have a fighting shot." Ethan nodded, though doubt lingered in his mind. Before he could respond, a soft creak echoed through the cabin. Robert tensed, his hand immediately reaching for his rifle. "Stay here," he whispered, moving toward the door. Ethan's pulse quickened as Robert stepped outside, his figure silhouetted against the faint glow of the porch light. The tension was suffocating, each second stretching into an eternity. Suddenly, a low voice cut through the silence. "Robert Hayes, long time no see." Ethan froze. The voice was unfamiliar, but carried a chilling calmness that set him on edge. Robert's voice was sharp. "What are you doing here, Logan?" Ethan crept toward the window, peering out cautiously. A man stood just beyond the porch, his hands raised in a mock gesture of peace. He was dressed in dark tactical gear, his face partially obscured by a hood. "I'm here to save you the trouble," Logan said, his tone almost casual. "Hand over the case, and this can all end without bloodshed." "You know I'm not doing that," Robert growled, his rifle trained on the man. Logan chuckled. "You always were stubborn. But think about the kid inside. Do you really want to drag him any deeper into this mess?" Ethan's stomach churned. Who was this man, and how did he know about him? "You've got 5 seconds to turn around and walk away," Robert warned. But before Logan could respond, the snap of a twig behind Robert made Ethan's blood run cold. Another figure emerged from the shadows, moving with eerie silence. "Robert, behind you!" Ethan shouted. But it was too late. The second man struck, knocking Robert's rifle aside. A scuffle ensued, the two figures locked in a brutal struggle. Logan took advantage of the chaos, rushing toward the cabin. Ethan acted on instinct, grabbing the case and backing away. Logan burst through the door, his movements swift and calculated. "Easy, kid," Logan said, his eyes locked on the case. "I don't want to hurt you. Just give me what I came for." Ethan's hands trembled, but he tightened his grip on the case. "Why do you want this so badly? What's in here that's worth killing for?" Logan smirked. "More than you can imagine. Now hand it over before you regret it." Ethan's gaze darted toward the back door. "You'll have to take it from me." Logan's smirk faded, replaced by a look of irritation. "Don't make me do this, kid." Before Logan could make his move, a gunshot rang out from outside. The sound startled both men, and Logan glanced toward the door, giving Ethan the split second. He needed to bolt. Ethan darted out the back, his heart pounding as he plunged into the dark forest. The sound of shouts and footsteps followed him, but he didn't look back. With the case clutched tightly against his chest, Ethan ran deeper into the night, the weight of betrayal and danger driving him forward. Ethan's lungs burned as he sprinted through the dark forest, rain slicking his face and clothes. the weight of the case pressed against his chest, a constant reminder of the danger chasing him. Behind him, Logan's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Find him! Don't let him get away!" Flashlights pierced the darkness, their beams slicing through the dense underbrush. Ethan zigzagged between trees, his heart pounding like a war drum. Every step felt like a gamble, one wrong move, and he could trip or be spotted. He didn't know where he was going. The forest seemed endless, the shadows playing tricks on his already frazzled mind. His only thought was to put as much distance as possible between himself and the men hunting him. A burst of static crackled in his earpiece, startling him. "Ethan, come in." "Robert?" Ethan whispered, slowing his pace to catch his breath. The connection was faint, but Robert's voice cut through. "Are you safe?" "I don't know. They're everywhere," Ethan hissed, crouching behind a fallen log as flashlights danced nearby. "I don't even know where I am." "Keep moving," Robert said, his voice strained. "Head south. There's a clearing, an old ranger station, about a mile from the cabin." Ethan wiped the rain from his face, his mind racing. "What about you?" "I'll catch up," Robert replied, though his tone betrayed his pain. The static grew louder, and the connection cut off. Ethan cursed under his breath, gripping the case tighter. He glanced around, trying to get his bearings. South. He needed to head south. Taking a deep breath, Ethan pushed forward, his movements slower and more deliberate this time. The flashlights behind him had fanned out, their beams growing dimmer, but the sound of boots crunching through the wet foliage reminded him they were still searching. Ethan's foot caught on an exposed root, sending him stumbling. He managed to catch himself before falling, but the noise drew the attention of one of the searchers. A flashlight beam swung in his direction, illuminating the glint of the case in his arms. "There! Over here!" a voice shouted. Panic surged through Ethan as he bolted again, weaving through the trees with renewed desperation. The shouts and footsteps grew louder, closing in on him. He spotted a ravine up ahead, its steep slope disappearing into darkness. It wasn't much of a choice, but it was all he had. Ethan didn't hesitate. He slid down the muddy incline, his momentum carrying him into a shallow creek at the bottom. The icy water shocked his system, but he scrambled to his feet, clutching the case. The sound of his pursuers faded slightly. The ravine had slowed them down. He pressed on, the creek bed guiding him like a natural path. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Ethan pushed forward, his muscles aching and his breath ragged. Finally, through the thinning trees, he saw it, a structure looming in the distance. The ranger station was a weathered building, its windows boarded up and its roof partially caved in. But to Ethan, it was salvation. He stumbled toward the door, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. When he reached it, he found it unlocked. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dark interior littered with debris. Ethan slid inside, leaning against the wall as he caught his breath. He set the case down carefully and scanned the room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through cracks in the wood. The station was abandoned but sturdy enough to provide temporary shelter. He spotted an old desk near the back, its drawers slightly ajar. A faded map pinned to the wall caught his attention. Before he could investigate further, the faint sound of footsteps reached his ears. His blood ran cold. They were still coming. Ethan grabbed the case and moved toward the back of the room, searching for an escape route. A small window above the desk offered a narrow exit, but it would take precious time to open. A shadow passed by the doorway, and Ethan froze. He held his breath as the door creaked open again, the beam of a flashlight sweeping across the room. "Ethan," Logan's voice called out, calm but menacing. "You've done well, kid, but it's over now. Hand over the case, and I'll let you walk away from this." Ethan's heart pounded as he pressed himself against the wall, the case in his hands. He knew Logan was lying. There was no walking away from this. The flashlight moved closer, and Ethan realized he had seconds to act. Gritting his teeth, He tightened his grip on the case and prepared himself for what came next. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finishing what Catherine and Robert had started, even if it meant risking everything. Ethan gripped the case tightly as Logan's shadow grew larger, the beam of his flashlight sweeping across the ranger station. Each second felt like an eternity as Ethan crouched behind the desk, his breath shallow and quiet. "Ethan," Logan's voice came again, smooth and mocking. "Do you really think you're getting out of this? You've done well for someone who doesn't belong in this game, but it's time to end this." The sound of boots scraping against the warped wooden floor sent shivers down Ethan's spine. He glanced at the narrow window above the desk, his only chance at escape. It would be tight, but he could make it if he moved quickly. As Logan's flashlight beam hovered dangerously close, Ethan made his move. Grabbing the case, he lunged for the window, pushing himself through the narrow opening with every ounce of strength he had left. The edges of the frame scraped his arms, but he didn't stop until he was outside. "There he is!" Logan shouted, his voice erupting with anger. Ethan hit the ground hard, the case pressed to his chest. Ignoring the sting in his knees, he scrambled to his feet and bolted into the forest once more. Shouts and footsteps erupted behind him, but the cover of night and the thick trees gave him a fighting chance. "Cut him off!" Logan barked, his voice fading slightly as Ethan gained distance. Ethan's legs burned, his lungs screaming for air, but he pushed forward. He couldn't stop now, not when he was so close. The sound of a rushing stream reached his ears, and moments later he stumbled onto its rocky bank. The water was shallow but fast-moving, glistening faintly in the moonlight. Across the stream, he spotted a faint outline Robert, leaning against a tree, clutching his side. "Robert!" Ethan called out, his voice hoarse. Robert looked up, his face pale but determined. "Keep moving. They're right behind you." Ethan splashed into the stream, the icy water biting at his legs as he waded across. When he reached the other side, Robert grabbed his arm, steadying him. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, noticing the blood seeping through Robert's jacket. "I'll live," Robert replied, though his voice was strained. He glanced at the case. "Do you still have it?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, but they're not far behind." Robert's jaw tightened. "Then we finish this. The extraction point is 1/2 a mile from here. Can you make it?" "I'm not leaving without you," Ethan said firmly. A flicker of gratitude crossed Robert's face. "Then let's go." They moved together, Ethan supporting Robert as best he could, while keeping an eye on their surroundings. The forest seemed alive with tension, every sound amplified by the weight of what was at stake. Ahead, the faint glow of headlights pierced through the trees. Ethan's heart leapt. This had to be the extraction team Catherine had mentioned. "We're almost there," Robert said, his voice faint but urgent. The headlights revealed a black SUV parked on a dirt road. A figure stepped out, their silhouette familiar. "Catherine?" Ethan called out, hope surging through him. "It's me," Catherine replied, waving them forward. "Hurry!" They stumbled toward the vehicle as Logan's voice echoed behind them. "Don't let them reach the car." Ethan turned to see Logan and his men breaking through the tree line, weapons raised. Bullets tore through the night, striking trees and kicking up dirt around them. "Get in!" Catherine shouted, opening the back door. Ethan shoved Robert into the vehicle before diving in himself, the case still clutched in his hands. Catherine slammed the door shut as the driver floored the gas, the SUV lurching forward. The tires screeched as the vehicle tore down the dirt road, leaving Logan and his men behind in a cloud of dust. Ethan collapsed against the seat, his chest heaving. "You made it," Catherine said, her relief evident. "Barely," Ethan replied, glancing at Robert, who was pale but conscious. "He needs help." "We've got a medic waiting at the rendezvous point," Catherine assured him. Ethan looked down at the case in his lap, its weight heavier than ever. "Did we really win?" Catherine met his gaze, her expression serious. "This is just the beginning. What you did tonight, What you risked, it gives us a chance to fight back, but the war isn't over. Ethan nodded, exhaustion washing over him. He didn't know what the future held, or how much more he could endure. But one thing was clear: his life would never be the same. As the SUV sped into the night, the distant glow of the city lights appeared on the horizon. For the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of hope, not just for himself, but for the world that deserved the truth. As the SUV disappeared into the safety of the city, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey he'd endured. What had started as a simple act of kindness on a rainy night had become a fight for survival, trust, and truth. Though his life would never return to normal, he knew he had taken the first step towards something greater, a chance to change the world. If you enjoyed this gripping story of courage and determination, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling tales that keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Ethan's shoes? Let us know. Stay tuned for more incredible stories. Until next time, keep believing in the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. See you in the next adventure.